The image that won't leave me isn't loud or bloody. It's a crooked pine standing alone in a little clearing late in the day, the light already thinning to that gray-blue color that makes the forest feel farther away than it is. There's a hush to the air broken only by the faint tick of insects and the distant rush of water you can't see yet. The bark on that tree is rough and dark, but halfway up the trunk, something pale catches the beam of a flashlight, a smooth oval that doesn't belong there at all. Cold air moves around it, sliding down from the higher rocks, smelling of wet stone and old sap and metal. The ground beneath is disturbed in a careful way, as if someone knelt there for a long time arranging things in a circle, and then walking away without looking back. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes at night, I don't hear screams or sirens. I just see that pale shape in the beam and feel the chill crawling up my arms. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that, before the forest started to feel like it was holding its breath, our lives were ordinary in the way you never recognize until it's gone. My days followed a rhythm as familiar as the sound of the train that cut through town at 6 every morning. I'd wake up to the rattle of the old swamp cooler in my bedroom window and the faint smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. The sun over Modesto in July doesn't rise gently. It slaps the roof with heat by 9 o'clock and pushes the neighborhood dogs into the shade. I spent my mornings tending a small garden out back, tomatoes, a few stubborn roses, basil that bolted too fast, and my afternoons at the library until I finally retired a year before all this happened. Even in retirement, I found myself alphabetizing my own bookshelves, the soft slide of paper and the faint, dusty smell of used paperbacks keeping me grounded. Hannah used to joke that my house smelled like old pages and lemon oil. When she was a little girl, she'd come barreling through my screen door, the springs whining in protest, and drop her backpack on the hardwood with a thud that shook the framed pictures of my parents. By the summer of 2016, she didn't barrel anywhere anymore. She moved with that loose confidence young adults get when they're just starting to believe the world might actually open up for them. But she still pushed that same screen door open with her hip and called out Aunt Linda in that bright, rising tone that always sounded like sunlight to me. The day that sticks in my mind, it was already close to 100 degrees outside. The air shimmered on the asphalt, and a lawnmower droned 2 houses down its engine, coughing under the strain. She came in wearing cut-off shorts, an old band t-shirt, and hiking boots that had seen better days. There was dust on the laces and a faint smell of trail dust and coconut sunscreen that clung to her when she hugged me. Caleb followed behind her, ducking his head a little, as if my doorway were lower than it really was. He was broad-shouldered but quiet, with that easy way of moving you see in people who grew up on dirt roads instead of concrete. His handshake was firm but not showy, his palm still cool from the car's air conditioning. I remember the way he glanced around my living room over the bookshelf wall, the crocheted blanket folded on the back of the couch, as though he were filing it all away. We sat at my kitchen table, the ceiling fan ticking overhead, stirring the smell of coffee and the faint sweetness of peaches ripening in a bowl. Hannah had spread a folded topographic map between us, its edges already soft and worn from being opened and closed too many times. Her fingernails were painted chipped blue, and as she traced the thin lines of trails with one finger, tiny flecks of color caught the light. Caleb pointed out contour lines and marked distances, his calloused finger tapping lightly on the paper. Outside, a truck rolled past on the street, its tires humming on the hot pavement, and for a moment the house felt like a cool little island in a world that was moving faster than I liked. They talked about their plan the way only 20-year-olds do, like they were reading from a script they'd been waiting their whole lives to perform. A week in Yosemite. No parents, no schedules, just the 2 of them. Backpacks on, heading out from the Tioga Road trailhead into country where the pine trees grow so tall they seem to lean over you. Hannah's eyes shone when she talked about waking up to the cold bite of mountain air instead of bus exhaust and city noise. "You'd love it up there, Aunt Linda," she said, her voice warm and insistent. The stars actually look like stars, not like someone spilled salt on gray paper. I remember the way the afternoon light slanted through the blinds, striping her face and arms with thin bars of gold and shadow. I listened nodding, but there was a knot low in my stomach. Even then, something I pushed aside as ordinary worry. I'd grown up hearing about lost hikers on the evening news. Still, the park was familiar, at least in my mind. I'd camped there in my 30s, waking to the smell of wood smoke and wet pine needles, and I knew it wasn't some mythic wilderness on another planet. People went in and came out every day. Caleb tried to reassure me without making a show of it. He mentioned his father's years in forestry, the way he'd been walking trails with his dad since he was a boy. He talked about bear canisters and water filters and weather radios in a level, practical tone that reminded me of my own father describing how to jack up a car and change a tire. His voice had that low, steady hum that felt like gravel under tires on a well-worn dirt road. Later that evening, we all drove over to my sister's house in Stockton for dinner. The air over the delta had that heavy river-warm feel to it, and mosquitoes whined near the porch light. Robert was at the grill, the sharp smell of lighter fluid already turning into the rich scent of searing meat. He wore his usual weekend uniform faded jeans, a polo shirt with his company's logo, a Bluetooth earpiece still tucked in one ear, even though he wasn't on a call. Diane moved through the kitchen and practiced loops, the clink of ice in glasses and the soft thud of cabinet doors closing marking her path. She hugged Hannah a little too tightly, her fingers gripping her daughter's shoulders for a second longer than Hannah liked. I saw the brief flicker of irritation cross Hannah's face before she smoothed it over with a smile. We ate at the patio table, paper plates bending under the weight of burgers and corn, the umbrella overhead doing its best to blunt the last of the sun. A neighbor's kids shrieked in a plastic kiddie pool next door, water slapping against cheap blue sides. Cicadas buzzed in the trees, their rattling song rising and falling like something mechanical. Conversation drifted from work to politics to the heat the way it always does when family gets together. Eventually, it circled back like a dog returning to a favorite spot to the trip. Robert had a beer in his hand, and that particular tightness at the corners of his mouth he got when he was trying not to sound controlling. "So, you're sure about the route?" he asked, the bottle sweating in his grip, droplets rolling down onto the table. "You're signing in at the station. Sticking to what you wrote?" Hannah sighed, but it was an affectionate sound, not a sharp one. "Dad, we've been over this. We signed the book. We stick to the plan. We text when we can. We're not disappearing into the Amazon." Her tone was light, but the word disappearing seemed to hang in the warm air for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Caleb picked up on the tension without jumping into it. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands folded loosely. "Mr. Mercer, I've walked that area before," he said. "We've got the maps, backup batteries, enough supplies. If the weather turns or something feels off, we head back. We're careful." His voice had a quiet conviction to it, like he was reassuring himself as much as anyone else. After dinner, while the men carried plates inside and Diane fussed with the leftover potato salad, I stood on the back step with Hannah. The sky over the neighborhood was fading from blue to a washed-out lavender, the first faint stars struggling against the streetlights. Someone down the block had started up a radio, and an old rock song floated over the fences, thin and tinny. Hannah leaned against the railing, the wood warm against her bare arms, and stared up as if she could see right past the haze to the high country she was heading into. "I just want to breathe different air for a while," she said quietly. "I feel like the city's crowding me in." Her breath smelled faintly of grilled corn and the mint from the iced tea. I told her I understood, and I did. At 20, I'd wanted to fling myself out into the world, too. Still, something about the way she said it made my skin prickle just for a heartbeat. The sprinklers kicked on in the front yard, then the soft hiss and sputter of water hitting dry grass breaking the moment. A car rolled past on the street, its headlights cutting a brief white path across the fence before sliding away. Life settled back into its usual noises. Over the next few days, our lives moved in their small, familiar circles while Hannah and Caleb prepared. They sent us pictures of gear spread out on the apartment floor, rolled sleeping bags, a little camp stove, packets of dehydrated food lined up like soldiers. In one photo, Hannah held up a red sweater she'd thrifted years before the knit, a little worn at the cuffs. In case it gets cold, she'd written in the message below, followed by a string of laughing emojis. I remember staring at that picture on my phone while the evening news muttered in the background about traffic on the Bay Bridge and some minor political scandal. Outside my window, a breeze pushed the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke into my living room. The night before they left, Hannah called me from the city. I could hear the muffled roar of traffic through her open window and the faint clatter of someone cooking in the apartment next door, pots hitting burners' cabinet doors knocking shut. She sounded tired but excited, her words tumbling over each other as she went through the final checklist. "We're heading out early," she said. "If I call you before we lose service, don't freak out if I drop off. You know how it is up there." There was a honk outside her building, sharp and irritated, and she laughed. "See, the universe is pushing me out of here." Her laughter carried a nervous edge beneath the brightness like a violin string tuned just a hair too tight. I went to bed that night with the window cracked open, letting in the warm, car-laced air. A distant siren wailed somewhere in town, then faded into nothing. I lay there listening to the ceiling fan creak and click, the blades chopping the thick summer heat, and tried to picture them the next morning. Two young people loading up a white car with packs and water bottles heading toward the mountains that rise blue and hazy on the horizon beyond our flat valley fields. The thought should have felt simple and clean, like turning a fresh page in a book. But there was a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name. A week later, on a Friday evening in early August, I sat in that same living room with the TV on low and the windows open to the sound of cicadas grinding in the trees. The sky outside was the color of old bruises, purple and gray, and the street lights flicked on one by one with a soft electrical hum. I'd left my phone on the coffee table screen facing up, expecting at least a short message sometime that night, back at the car, or see you tomorrow, or even just a picture of dusty boots on pavement. As the hours slid by, the ice in my glass melted, thinning the taste of sweet tea, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. My porch light clicked on automatically at 9, washing the front steps in a warm yellow glow, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in my little house felt heavier than it should have, as if it were waiting for something that refused to arrive. The first sign that something was wrong came in the smallest, quietest way, the kind you shrug off at first because life teaches you not to make trouble where none exists. It was a Saturday morning, warm already by 9, the kind of heat that pressed its palm against the windows and promised another long valley afternoon. I was rinsing out the coffee pot when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a missed call from my sister, just one ring's worth, the kind that happens when someone hits the button by accident. I didn't think much of it. But the voicemail that followed her voice, thin and stretched like she was talking through a cracked door, made something in my ribs tighten. She asked if I'd heard from Hannah yet, said she thought she would have checked in by now, and tried to laugh it off. The laugh didn't land. It hung there, brittle as dry leaves. I remember looking at the digital clock on my stove and telling myself it wasn't strange. Not really. Mountain hikes end late all the time. Maybe they were standing in a spot without service. Maybe they'd stopped to watch the sun drop behind the ridgeline. I told myself these things as I wiped down the counter, the rag dragging softly over the tile, leaving a faint lemon smell behind. Still, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for it to light up with some casual message from Hannah, one of her little half-cent photos of a rock formation or a sunset she thought I'd like. Nothing came. By afternoon, the heat had settled like a thick blanket over the neighborhood. Cicadas screamed from the ash trees, and kids rode bikes up and down the street, tires hissing on the pavement. My sister called again, this time speaking faster, her words edged with a tremble she couldn't quite hide. "They should have been back at the car by now," she said. "Caleb always said they'd check in." I could hear Robert in the background, his voice low and clipped the way it got when he was trying to stay calm and failing. There was the sound of a drawer slamming shut, then another. I asked when they were due out, and she said yesterday. A simple sentence, nothing dramatic. But it felt like someone had opened a window in my stomach and let all the air out. I drove to their house, even though she didn't ask me to. The sky had started to dim with that dusty late summer haze that turns everything a muted gold. When I pulled up, their porch light was already on, fighting the dusk, even though it wasn't dark enough yet for it to matter. Inside, the house felt too bright, every lamp on. The kitchen smelled like cold coffee and the faint sharpness of worry, a smell I'd come to know too well in the weeks that followed. Diane paced from the sink to the table, back and forth, arms folded tight across her chest. She looked smaller somehow, as though the light around her had thinned. On the table sat a stack of printouts, trail maps, weather forecasts, screenshots of the Tioga Road access page. Her reading glasses lay upside down beside them, one lens smeared like she'd wiped at her face without thinking. Robert hovered near the sliding door, staring out at the backyard as if expecting the kids to walk in through the gate. His breath fogged the glass each time he leaned closer. He kept repeating, "They're probably fine. They're probably fine," but the words didn't sound like comfort. They sounded like steps taken out onto thin ice. We tried calling again first. Hannah's phone, then Caleb's. Each call rang longer than it should have before collapsing into that flat, automated voice telling us the person was unavailable. The sound of it filled the kitchen like static. When I set my phone down, my hand trembled just enough for the screen to wobble on the wood. I didn't hide it well. By 7 o'clock, Robert said we should contact the park. His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat like it was nothing. I watched him step into the living room, the TV still playing softly on mute, and dial the number with slow, deliberate movements. The ceiling fan clicked overhead, throwing soft shadows across the walls. Diane stood beside me, her hand resting cold against my arm, her breath shallow and uneven. I couldn't hear the ranger on the other end, but I saw the change in Robert's face, the tightening around his mouth, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch. When he hung up, he said the car hadn't moved. It was still at the trailhead, sitting there like a question waiting for an answer. He didn't say it with fear. He said it like he'd been punched. We left immediately. The drive from Stockton to Yosemite has always felt long, but that night it stretched into something endless. The sky above the highway was a deep burnt orange, fading into black, and the air that rushed through my cracked window smelled like dust and dry grass. The trucks on the interstate rumbled past with the low, thunderous groan of engines too tired to complain. None of us talked much. Now and then, Diane would whisper, maybe their phone died, or maybe they stayed an extra night. Each guest trailed off into silence. When we turned onto the winding road that led toward the park, the temperature dropped fast. The windows fogged near the edges. Pines crowded closer, their dark silhouettes flickering past the headlights like tall, patient witnesses. The deeper we drove, the more I felt the night pressing in. The woods had a stillness to them, as if holding a breath. At the ranger station, the air smelled of cold earth and the faint tang of metal from the floodlights. A young ranger with a sunburned nose and tired eyes met us out front. He spoke gently, but the words came with the steady cadence of someone who had delivered similar news before. Yes, the car was still there. Yes, the entry in the trail register said they intended to be out yesterday. No, There had been no communication. No one had reported seeing them on any main trail. He told us it was too early to assume anything, but he said it in a way that felt like padding, not truth. We followed his truck down the quiet park road, turning off onto the small lot where the vehicles of backpackers lined up in neat rows. The gravel popped under the tires, each sound too sharp in the cool night. A few headlights glowed dimly across the lot, catching sparkles of dust in the air. Our breath came out in faint clouds as we stepped out. Their car sat exactly where it was supposed to, white paint dulled from years of sun, a thin layer of trail dust settling over the windshield. The windows reflected the moonlight, and for a moment it looked like the car was asleep. Nothing broken, nothing forced open, just waiting. Diane reached the driver's side first. She gripped the door handle, her knuckles pale as if she expected it to swing open with her daughter inside. When it didn't move, she bowed her head, the cold night air stirring her hair. I heard the little sound she made, half sob, half disbelief, and it cut through me sharper than any alarm. The ranger unlocked the door with the spare key the kids had left with Hannah's parents. Inside, the air held the faint mix of sunscreen, old upholstery, and something sweet, maybe the wrappers they'd bought at the gas station days before. Their spare clothes sat folded in a canvas bag on the back seat. A charger lay coiled near the console. A few bottles of water rolled softly when the ranger shifted the seat. Nothing was scattered. Nothing was missing. It looked like two young people had stepped out expecting to return before sundown. Robert stood beside me, hands on his hips, his breath measuring itself against the cold. "They planned to come back," he whispered. He wasn't talking to me or the ranger. He was talking to himself, anchoring the words like tent stakes into soil that suddenly felt unsteady. For a moment, none of us moved. The darkness around the parking lot hummed with crickets, and somewhere far off, water rushed over rocks. I felt the night seep into my bones. The ranger said he would make a few calls, let his supervisor know, start a preliminary sweep of the immediate area. It was phrased like a routine checklist item, but his eyes betrayed something heavier, a look I'd come to recognize as the beginning of dread. As he walked back to his truck, his radio crackled softly, the static carrying through the trees like a restless whisper. Diane sank onto the low wooden barrier at the edge of the lot. Her hands trembled against her knees as if she couldn't keep them still. I sat beside her, the cold from the timber seeping through my jeans. The moon had slipped behind a cloud, dimming the lot even more, making the car look lonelier somehow. Robert drifted a few steps away, staring down the trailhead as though he could will the kids to appear out of that darkness. His shoulders twitched now and then, the way a person's do when they're holding back something they don't want to name. The pine needles around us rustled with a faint passing breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and distant granite. I remember thinking absurdly that if I listened hard enough, I might hear their laughter drifting back toward us, that the mountains might echo them somehow. But the forest stayed silent. A few minutes later, as we huddled there under the dim glow of the ranger's headlights, another vehicle turned off the road and slowly rolled into the lot. The engine clicked as it cooled, and a door opened with a soft, deliberate creak. A sheriff's deputy stepped out, adjusting the brim of his hat as he walked toward us. He moved slowly, as if every step carried a weight he didn't want to deliver. He stopped a few feet away, lowered his voice, and removed his hat before speaking. And in that simple gesture, barely a second long, I felt the ground shift beneath us as though something far larger than any of us had already begun. By the time the sun pushed over the ridgeline that next morning, the quiet parking lot outside the Tioga trailhead had changed from a place where hikers laced their boots to something that felt like a staging ground. A sheriff's SUV idled near the entrance, its headlights still on in the early light, throwing long, pale beams across the gravel. Rangers moved with a kind of practiced economy, unlocking storage sheds, pulling out heavy packs, uncoiling ropes and radio cords that scraped softly against metal. The air held that crisp mountain bite, thin, clean, and cold enough that every breath left a faint cloud behind. I remember rubbing my hands together just to keep them warm, listening to the low murmur of voices that didn't match the calm Yosemite mornings I'd always known. This wasn't a family worry anymore. It had shifted into something larger, something official and heavy, the kind of machinery that wakes only when it senses real danger. A deputy walked over and asked for the kid's last known itinerary. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were searching, weighing things he didn't want to say yet. Diane's hands shook as she unfolded the printout of the trail map, the paper rattling softly like it was caught in a breeze even though the air was still. Robert stood beside her, jaw locked, answering questions in short, practical bursts. What they carried, what they wore when they'd last checked in. I watched the ranger jot everything down on a clipboard, his pencil tapping against the metal clip each time he paused to think. I could hear birds calling somewhere deep in the trees, their bright morning chatter strangely out of place. By mid-morning, more vehicles arrived, volunteer trucks with dusty tires, a canine unit with 2 dogs pacing eagerly behind their kennel doors, and another ranger SUV carrying a stack of topographic maps rolled under elastic bands. The sound of radios crackling filled the air, each burst of static followed by a clipped exchange about coordinates and routes. Someone laid a large laminated map across the hood of a green pickup, anchoring the corners with thermoses and a stack of gloves. The deputies gathered around it, their shadows stretching long across the ground, moving over the thin red lines of trails circling sections with grease pencils. The smell of pine sap drifted in as the sun warmed the forest floor, mixing with the dusty scent of engines cooling. When they started moving out, the teams fanned in different directions, some up toward the rocky switchbacks, others along the low creek beds. I walked a few steps with one group until the lead ranger turned and gently told us to stay near the lot. His tone wasn't unkind, just firm in the way someone speaks when they're trying to keep emotions from complicating the work. I stood there feeling the gravel shift under my shoes, watching the orange vests disappear into the shadows of the pines. The dogs barked once, eager to follow, before handlers hushed them and led them onto the damp trail where their noses dropped immediately to the ground. The sound of boots crunching over dry needles faded quickly, swallowed by the forest in a way that made my chest tighten. Hours passed in slow, heavy stretches. The sky stayed clear, a bright blue that felt indifferent to the fear it shone down on. Every so often, a ranger would return briefly to the lot, stepping out of the woods with leaves stuck to his pants or a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. Each time we lifted our heads, bracing ourselves. Each time he shook his head or said nothing yet before heading back out. One ranger mentioned a faint impression near a stream, maybe a boot print, but he followed it for less than 200 feet before it vanished into hard soil. He showed us a picture on his phone, zoomed in on the shallow mark. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, trying to make it belong to someone I loved. But the ranger was honest. It could have been anyone. The dogs picked up something at first, just a flicker of interest at the fork of a narrow stream, but a few hundred yards beyond, they froze, confused, then began circling with low whines. Their handlers exchanged looks I didn't like. It was as if the scent simply dissolved, lost not to wind or water, but to some kind of sudden absence. When they returned to the lot for a break, the dogs drank noisily from metal bowls, their sides heaving, and I could see mud caked around their paws. The handlers kept their voices low, but I heard one say, "It dropped off fast," and another answer, "Too fast." Those words stuck with me. By midday, a helicopter thumped its way over the ridge, the sound dropping like a slow heartbeat into the valley. Its shadow skimmed across the treetops, moving in broad sweeps as it followed the creek lines and stepped valleys that stretched out like folded cloth beneath it. The rotor wash sent loose needles swirling through the parking lot, brushing against my ankles with a dry whisper. Diane flinched every time the helicopter banked, as though each turn might reveal something she wasn't ready to face. Robert stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the sky until his eyes watered. The faint smell of aviation fuel drifted down when the helicopter circled lower, searching the edges of a remote meadow. Twice it hovered so long in one spot that my stomach clenched. Both times, it eventually peeled away. Deputies brought in a portable canopy and set up a command post beside the ranger station. Maps were taped to the side of a truck, updates scrawled in marker as teams radioed back. Trails cleared, ravines checked, campsites inspected. Every note felt like another door closing. One ranger mentioned finding a small scrap of fabric near a fallen log, but when they brought it back, it turned out to be the wrong color, too faded, too old, just a remnant from some unknown hiker years before. Another team radioed about a fire ring tucked behind a cluster of boulders, but it was cold, half buried in dirt, probably weeks old. Nothing lined up with what we needed. People from nearby towns began trickling in to help. Some carried trekking poles and hydration packs. Others showed up with nothing but strong legs and determined faces. One woman from Mariposa brought a bag of sandwiches and set them on a picnic table without a word. The smell of mustard and warm bread wafted through the air, but none of us were hungry. A man from Oakhurst said he'd seen something strange on the trail the week before. Just a shape moving between trees, he said. Maybe a deer, maybe not. A pair of climbers reported hearing a distant voice echo off the cliffs near dawn, but no one could say which direction it truly came from. Hearsay stacked on hearsay, each piece floating just out of reach of anything real. By late afternoon, theories began to ripple through the searchers, passed quietly between volunteers or murmured in the corners of the lot. Some said the kids might have gotten off trail and followed an unmarked drainage. Others mentioned sudden storms rolling through the high country, even though the skies had been clear all week. A few locals whispered older stories, the kind people bring up only when the woods start feeling unfamiliar. Tales about folks wandering too far into the backcountry, never meant to be found. I didn't put stock in legends, but the tone of those whispers made my skin prickle. People who knew these mountains well were uneasy, and that unsettled me more than anything else. There was one moment, small, easy to overlook, that has stayed with me. A ranger older than the others, with deep sun lines around his eyes, knelt by the tailgate of his truck, brushing dirt from the tread of his boot. He wasn't aware I was watching. He paused, staring at that dirt for a long moment, then closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose, slow and heavy. Not frustrated, not tired. Something else. Something like resignation. When he lifted his gaze, he saw me and forced a reassuring smile. But the moment before that smile was the truer one. As the light started to fade, teams began returning boots, scraping against the gravel radios clipped to their shoulders, crackling with faint bursts of static. Some carried branches that had snagged on their packs. Others wiped sweat from their temples with the backs of their gloves. All of them had the same expression. A careful blankness, a practiced way of masking disappointment so the families wouldn't see the truth in their eyes. The evening air cooled fast, carrying the smell of wet bark and the metallic tang of the nearby creek. Someone lit a portable lantern near the command post, and its glow threw long shadows across the map taped to the truck. More and more sections had been crossed out with dark lines, areas cleared. Nothing found. Diane sat on a folding chair. Someone brought her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Knuckles pale in the rising night. Robert paced in tight circles, his footsteps crunching rhythmically over the gravel, until even that sound began to feel frayed. I felt the cold creeping through my jacket and into my bones. The silence between conversations stretched longer. The forest around us seemed to press closer, as if waiting. A deputy stepped out of the shadows near the command post, holding something small and wrapped in his hand, a piece of paper or maybe a photograph. He spotted the supervising ranger and walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps. The ranger straightened, set his pencil down on the map, and leaned in to listen. Their voices dropped low. The deputy unfolded whatever he was carrying and held it under the lantern light. The ranger's brow furrowed. He didn't call out to us, didn't wave anyone over. He simply touched one corner of the map with his finger, marking a place none of us had talked about yet. A place deeper than any team had reached that day. And in that small motion, the air around us shifted as though the night itself understood that something new had entered the story. I had been standing near the command post for so long that the cold from the ground had crept through my shoes and settled into my legs. The lanterns cast soft pools of yellow over the gravel, and every voice carried too clearly in the thinning air. I remember the moment the search shifted because it began with a single sharp burst of static from a ranger's radio, different from the usual chatter, higher-pitched, urgent enough to straighten every back in the lot. Then a voice came through, clipped and low, as though the person speaking didn't want to alert whatever might be around them. The supervising ranger didn't even finish the coffee he'd been sipping. He set the cup down on the tailgate and reached for his pack with deliberate, practiced movements. One of the deputies stopped mid-sentence. Even the dogs went still. Something had been found. You didn't have to hear the words to know. The air around us tightened thin as pulled thread. The ranger pointed toward a stretch of trees far beyond the initial grid. A few searchers trotted toward their truck's boots, striking the ground with hurried, uneven thuds. Diane rose from her chair, one hand gripping the armrest as if she needed it to anchor herself. She wasn't asking questions anymore. Her body already knew what her mind didn't want to accept. Robert moved toward the officers so quickly the folding chair he'd been leaning against toppled behind him with a soft clatter. I followed a few steps behind them, feeling the cold air burn in my throat. The forest ahead lay dark and unbroken except for the faint bounce of flashlight beams weaving between trunks. They made us stay back at the edge of the lot, but I could see the rangers clustering at the trailhead where the ground dipped toward a narrow ravine. Voices rose and fell, muffled by distance and trees. One ranger lifted his hand, calling others closer with a quick wave. Another clipped a strip of orange tape to a branch, the plastic snapping in the breeze. A deputy jogged back toward the parking area, breathing hard, and spoke quietly to the supervising officer. I caught only fragments deep in, hard to reach, not recent. The words sent a slow chill through my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. They moved fast after that. More tape went up. Radios crackled in sharp bursts. The beam of a spotlight swept the nearby tree line, turning the needles white for an instant before slipping away again. One of the searchers came trudging back toward us with his shoulders bent, his boots coated in a mud I hadn't seen anywhere else that week. His face was pale beneath the rim of his hat, and he didn't look up when he passed. Something in his gait, slow, heavy, deliberate, told me he had seen too much. They brought us forward only when they had secured the perimeter, guiding us along a narrow cut in the earth. The ground grew uneven as we approached the clearing rocks scattered like bones beneath our feet. The air took on a different smell, cooler, sharper, carrying a mineral tang I recognized from caves I'd visited as a child. And then before I saw anything, I felt it, a change in the atmosphere, a pressure settling across the clearing that made the night feel like it was holding its breath. Flashlights swung in wide arcs, catching on trunks and underbrush until they found a particular tree set slightly apart from the rest. It was an old pine, its bark rough and darkened with age, leaning like it had weathered too many winters. The rangers' lights hovered there, not moving, as though afraid to touch what they'd found. When my eyes adjusted to the spill of light, I saw it. Not all at once, just a pale curve, at first smooth and bone-white against the dark bark. Then the full shape emerged, lit from below by the searching beams. A skull. A human skull fixed high up the trunk, held there by a single thick nail driven deep into the wood. My breath left me in a slow, broken exhale. My knees softened so suddenly I had to steady myself on the trunk of a nearby cedar. The cold radiating from the ground seeped into my hands as I leaned against it. Behind the old pine, the forest stretched out in a black wall, silent as stone. Around the base of the trunk, arranged in a wide, almost perfect circle, were bones, long ones, small ones placed with unsettling precision. No scattering from animals, no signs of weathering or haphazard movement. Someone had been there. Someone had worked there, piece by piece. A forensic tech moved in front of me, blocking my view for a moment as he photographed the scene. His camera shutter clicked softly, rhythmically, as though capturing stills of a moment no one should ever have to see. The light from his flash bounced off the bark and bone, filling the clearing with stuttering bursts of white. I saw Robert through one of those flashes, his face drained of all color, his mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on the tree as though trying to will it into something else. Diane stood beside him, her hands clasped together at her chest, shoulders shaking with quiet, uneven breaths she tried to hold down. Someone touched my elbow, a deputy guiding me backward, urging me to give the techs space. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet as I stepped away from the center of the clearing. Even from the edge, the sight of that tree carved itself into my memory. The dark trunk, the pale bone, the ring of remains that looked almost ceremonial. There was no mistaking what it meant. No room for hopeful explanations. It didn't take long for confirmation. A few hours later, though, in memory it feels like days, a ranger approached us near the trailhead. His flashlight hung at his side, casting a dim halo around the gravel. He spoke softly, as if afraid of how easily sound traveled in the cold night air. The skull had been compared to dental records. The match was exact. Caleb was gone. And he had died in a way no one should have to imagine. I didn't cry. Not then. I felt hollow, emptied out, the kind of numb that makes you aware of your own pulse only because there's nothing else left to feel. Diane let out a sound halfway between a sob and a gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Robert closed his eyes, his shoulders heaving once, then again. He didn't fall, but it looked like standing cost him every ounce of strength he had ever carried. In the hours that followed, the clearing transformed into something closer to a crime scene than a search site. Yellow tape stretched between trees, glowing faintly in the lantern light. More vehicles arrived, county, then state, their tires crunching over the gravel in slow, heavy rolls. Investigators examined every inch of the area, kneeling beside the circle of bones, measuring distances, sketching angles on notepads that fluttered in the breeze. Their voices were low, deliberate, weighted with the kind of caution that comes when you know you're walking inside someone else's nightmare. When they found the second set of remains, smaller, scattered, harder to identify, the clearing grew even quieter. I heard a tech murmur something about likely female, and I felt my stomach twist into a knot so tight I thought I might fold in on myself. They wouldn't confirm anything that night, they said. The DNA work would take time, but the look exchanged between two of the investigators told us enough. Later, farther inside the valley, they uncovered something more, another place, hidden behind a curtain of falling water, a cold stone chamber untouched by summer heat. Inside it, arranged meticulously on a flat slab, were the kids' belongings. Their packs, their sleeping bags, a bracelet I knew Hannah had worn since high school, and a camera belonging to Caleb. Seeing those objects lined up so neatly, so intentionally, broke something inside me that the skull alone hadn't reached. That cave wasn't just a hiding place. It was an exhibit, a shrine of sorts, created by a mind I didn't want to understand. The investigators called in specialists, anthropologists, linguists, anyone who could make sense of the symbols scratched into the cave walls. Circles, crosses, rough shapes of two figures. It took days of analysis, and I watched it unfold from the periphery, clinging to every new detail like it might hold a thread of sanity. Eventually, the truth emerged. Someone had been living in those woods for years. Someone with an obsession carved from grief and delusion, and he hadn't been alone. The journals they unearthed in a hidden cabin farther west filled in the rest. 2 men, one a former engineer named Daniel Cross, the other a former ranger called the Pathfinder. Both broken by loss clinging to an invented ritual they believed would bind pure love beyond the world. They had followed the kids from the trailhead, stalked them deep into the backcountry, and performed the same twisted ceremony described in the writings of long-gone tribes they'd misunderstood. Caleb's fate had been sealed in that clearing. Hannah's remains were harder to piece together, but the notebook described exactly what they had done and why. That was the truth we had feared spelled out with clinical devotion in Cross's handwriting. When the second cabin burned with the Pathfinder inside, whether by accident or intention, we were told the threat was over. That Cross might have perished with him or fled far from the park, but the file on him remained open even if the public story said otherwise. That night, after all the teams withdrew and the clearing grew silent again, we were driven back to the sheriff's office in Mariposa. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead too bright for the hour, washing everything in a sterile glow. Coffee cups sat half full on desks, and officers moved quietly as though afraid to disturb the fragile space between shock and grief. Diane cried softly in a corner, her hand wrapped in Robert's. I sat on a stiff plastic chair by the window, watching the sky lighten with the first pale hint of dawn. There was no going back to the world we had known. Not after what was found in that valley. Not after seeing the truth nailed into the heart of an old pine tree. And as the sun finally broke over the mountains, casting long bars of gold across the floor, I understood that what lay ahead wouldn't be closure. It would be reckoning. In the hours after the clearing in the valley was sealed off, everything blurred into a strange, breathless rhythm. The deputies moved with a kind of respectful urgency, their radios snapping out short orders, every voice low, as though sound itself might break the ground beneath us. Floodlights were brought in on portable stands, washing the lot in a harsh white glow that flattened every shadow. The smell of damp pine and gasoline hung in the air sharp enough to make my throat feel tight. I watched investigators carry evidence bags to and from their vehicles, each one zipped and labeled with careful handwriting, and I felt the weight of it settling deeper on my chest. This was no longer a missing persons search. It was something far darker, something that had been hidden with purposeful hands. We were escorted into a temporary command trailer where a pot of coffee burned on a warmer, and the hum of an air conditioning unit rattled in the corner. Diane sat beside me on a metal bench, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup she never brought to her lips. Her shoulders shook in quick, uneven bursts as if her body were trying to process something her mind refused to accept. Robert stood by the window, staring out at the trucks pulling in and out of the lot, the light bouncing off his glasses. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, but edged with disbelief. "They were just hiking," he kept saying. "They were just hiking." The way he repeated it made it feel like a prayer he didn't believe in anymore. The sheriff arrived not long after dawn, his uniform freshly pressed, but his face drawn with lines that hadn't been there the night before. He briefed us in a quiet room lined with maps and whiteboards filled with grids. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing the space in a sterile glow. His words came slowly, as though each one needed to be softened before it reached us. They had found enough to confirm one death. They expected more answers soon. They were bringing specialists into the valley. I felt the world around me narrow to the faint smell of old carpet underfoot, and the cool metal of the chair pressing against my palms. News traveled quickly. By noon, reporters had gathered near the park entrance, their satellite vans lined up like sentries. They weren't allowed near the clearing, but the rumors were enough to stir the whole region. Calls poured into the sheriff's office, some from concerned residents, others from people claiming they had seen something or knew something. Most of those calls led nowhere. A few were unsettling enough to make the deputies exchange looks. The sense of unease spread through the community like fog rolling off a river. People stopped speaking loudly in the grocery store. Conversations in coffee shops were hushed, angled toward the whisper of details no one fully understood yet. When investigators uncovered the cave behind the waterfall and the cabin in the far canyon, the shock deepened. The items found in those places, packaged memories laid out with a strange reverence, turned the story into something none of us could have imagined. We learned about the two men broken in ways we couldn't fathom, who had created a ritual out of grief, twisting old myths into something violent and obsessive. We learned how they watched the kids, followed them, planned every step. That knowledge settled over us like cold dust. It didn't bring comfort. It didn't bring closure. It simply provided a name for the darkness, and sometimes that's harder to live with than ignorance. The official line was that one man had died in the fire at the second cabin, the Pathfinder, they called him, and that he alone was responsible. That explanation was clean, easy to place in a press release, and simple enough to reassure visitors who wanted the park to feel safe again. But behind closed doors, among those of us who were closer to the case than we ever wanted to be, we knew the story was incomplete. Daniel Cross, the man who wrote the journals, the one who understood the myths and designed the rituals, was never found. His fingerprints were on the pages. His words described the plan. But the fire left nothing that could confirm his fate. For some, that uncertainty became an open wound. For me, it became a quiet, persistent worry that settled in the back of my mind like a branch tapping against a window on a windy night. The months that followed were slow and fragmented. Diane withdrew into a stillness I had never seen in her before. Some days she stared out the living room window for hours, fingers resting lightly against the glass as though she expected movement outside. Robert threw himself into tasks arranging paperwork, talking with investigators, fielding calls from journalists until the weight of it broke through the cracks. More than once I found him sitting alone in his garage, elbows on his knees, the faint smell of motor oil and dust hanging around him like a curtain. Caleb's family grieved in their own way, quiet and steady, anchored by the rhythms of the hills where they lived. I visited them once, months later, and we sat on their porch with mugs of cooling coffee while the afternoon wind rustled through the pines. No one spoke much. Sometimes silence is the only language grief understands. The town changed too. In Modesto, people who had never met Hannah or Caleb spoke about them with the reverence usually reserved for old local legends. Hikers became more cautious. Parents double-checked their children's plans with a new kind of vigilance. I noticed small shifts everywhere, people locking their doors earlier, neighbors lingering a little longer on their porches at dusk, conversations turning serious whenever Yosemite was mentioned. Even I found myself avoiding certain paths at the local park, the ones that wound too far beneath the trees where the light thinned. It wasn't fear so much as respect, a recognition that the world held shadows we didn't always see. In time, I returned to my usual routines. I tended my garden, the smell of tomato vines and damp soil grounding me on mornings when the memories pressed too close. I dusted the shelves in my living room, running my fingers over book spines the way I once did in the library. But small reminders caught me off guard. A red sweater on a mannequin in a store window, the low whoosh of a helicopter passing overhead, the sight of two young people laughing together on a trail. Each moment pulled me back to the valley, to the cold air, and the thin circle of bones at the base of that pine tree. What stayed with me most wasn't the horror of the scene, though that memory never truly faded. It was the way small choices, choosing a trail, choosing a day, choosing to chase a bit of adventure, could brush up against someone else's madness without anyone realizing it. It made me appreciate fragile things in a way I hadn't before: the warmth of a porch light on a winter evening, the sound of a voice calling your name as you step inside, the simple comfort of knowing the people you love are within reach. I learned painfully that not every story ends with answers neatly tied together. Some end with missing pages. Some end with a question mark carved into the quiet of your life. I have visited that valley only once since then. It was a cold morning, pale light drifting between the trees, the air carrying the smell of wet stone and distant snow. I didn't go near the clearing. The area remains closed to the public out of respect and caution. But I stood at the edge of the trail and listened to the water rushing far below its sound, steady and unbroken. I thought about the kids, about Hannah's laugh, about Caleb's calm echoes that felt close enough to touch. And I realized then that some stories do not disappear. They settle into the land, into the people who remain, and into the quiet spaces of our days. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the morning sun stretching across the valley, lighting the trees with a soft, golden glow. It looks peaceful, almost untouched. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of what was lost, and the reminder of how easily the world can change without warning. It stays with me, a whisper in the back of my mind, a shadow that lengthens when the light grows thin. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.